Well, welcome to this issue of Stump the Pastor. Today's question comes from Robbie in Michigan. And she says, I heard a pastor on TV talk about the Apostle Paul having gone to the third heaven. Is there a third heaven? And if so, where would I look for it in the Bible? Well, thanks, Robbie, for the question. I appreciate you being part of this. On one level, your question is very easy to answer because there is a specific verse where this is mentioned. It's in 2 Corinthians 12:2, where Paul describes a spiritual experience that took him to the third heaven. Now, he doesn't offer any other information about the third heaven, and the phrase doesn't appear in the rest of the Bible as far as I can tell. So I had to do some research on this. There is some element within Judaism, Christianity, and Islam altogether having ideas of multiple levels of heaven. Some writers mention 7 levels of heaven, for example. Also, the Church of the Latter-day Saints mentions levels of heaven in some of their writings that they hold sacred. So in these cases, the number of heavens seems to refer to some depth of the spiritual experience. The better the experience, the higher level of heaven that was attained. So that might have been what Paul was mentioning in 2 Corinthians, but really we can only speculate. I think that part of our interest in things like this, particularly around heaven, has often been about needing a place where we experience eternity. We usually, for example, think of heaven as being above us, and that's because Genesis put the heavens above when creation happens. In fact, both creation stories in the book of Genesis talk about the heavens, not heaven, but the heavens. And the concept of a singular heaven wouldn't even come about until much later in biblical history. So for some, heavens are simply the sky above us with its stars, its planets, its vast space. Even today we still refer to that as the heavens. For those of you who know me or know my theology, you probably won't be surprised to hear me say that I don't consider heaven as a place. So like many of you, I was raised with the idea of heaven being the home of God, or the place where good people go when we die. And there is a great deal of comfort that comes in thinking that our deceased loved ones are with God, enveloped in love, and that is heaven. One of the things I have come to believe in my theology, as my theology has evolved over years, is to think of all things godly in metaphorical language rather than material language. So we can't really fathom the reality we call God. And just as our brains have no good words or concepts that encapsulate that reality, so also it's true with our concepts of heaven. God is always more than, greater than, other than our best descriptions. And since our words are so poor at conveying that experience, I found it more helpful to talk about heaven in experiential metaphors. So if God is found in my experience of grace or love or joy, then heaven might be found in our experience of being in God's presence. You see, I have no idea if there are multiple levels of heaven that serve different purposes. I simply trust that God's grace is more comprehensive than what I experience in my brief life on this earth. So I don't know if this makes sense to you, Robbie, but I have tried to learn how to let go of God making sense and simply savor those moments where I experience God's grace and touch. And yes, even touch is a metaphor. But you know when it happens, right? So to return to your question, the Bible doesn't give us much to work with when talking about heaven number 1 or heaven number 3. There's probably some Jewish context for Paul's reference that made sense during his life with the Corinthians. But since the idea of multiple heavenly levels seems to span lots of the religious spectrum, it seems to me that there is this desire by humans to quantify, to measure, to encapsulate that simply elude our best efforts to nail them down. Now, this may not be a satisfying answer, but in my spiritual journey, I have found that faith is more about being aware of God's grace when it is experienced, and less about making God, and in this case, heaven, understandable. So there you go, Robbie. I have found nothing beyond that one verse in 2 Corinthians that even mentions a third heaven. So maybe Paul was simply describing an important moment for him. So he was emphasizing that this wasn't any normal spiritual experience, but something much more profound. But I can tell you this. I hope that you have many heavenly experiences that so transform you that God's grace is available to your life and you find glimpses of that reality that is heaven. So thanks, Robbie, for helping us all struggle with this spiritual idea in this edition of Stump the Pastor. Thanks, Robbie, for your question, and I hope that I have raised some things that make lots of us ask questions. If you have some ideas about heaven or any of the other questions that we have considered here on Stump the Pastor, let me know. Send them to me at my email address or send them to the website here at Pilgrim. We'll see you next week on Stump the Pastor.